Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're stepping into some really interesting, maybe even unusual territory.
I feel like.
We've been looking at this audio recording, right, where someone shares their personal story and connects things like electronic harassment, Morgellons disease.
And this idea of a universal fungal biofilm on our skin.
Exactly. So our mission today is really just to unpack that central argument. What is this person actually claiming based on what they've seen and experienced?
Right. It's about understanding their perspective, their attempt to find an explanation for some really complex and often quite distressing symptoms. The source is purely their account, their hypothesis.
And, if you've ever felt maybe dismissed when talking about health issues or experienced weird physical stuff you couldn't explain,
Or even if you're just curious about unconventional ideas.
yeah, then this look into one person's viewpoint should be, well, definitely thought-provoking,
Yeah.
even if it's controversial.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dive into the main claim. This speaker starts with this foundational idea.
Mhm.
We all have this fungal biofilm on our skin, universally.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't stop there. They're suggesting this isn't just, there. It's actually a key player in what people experience if they identify with having Morgellons.
Or if they feel they're a targeted individual.
Precisely. The speaker tries to tie these quite different experiences together with this single thread.
So for Morgellons, where people report skin issues, maybe fibers coming out, which is, still debated medically.
Right, a very complex and often misunderstood condition.
This person says, look, those things aren't coming from your skin tissue itself. They're actually growths on this external biofilm.
Yeah, and the speaker seems to present this as a way to perhaps help these individuals feel a bit more validated, maybe, when they talk to doctors, giving them a different framework.
Makes sense. And then for the targeted individuals, people feeling pain, twitching, weird sensations, they attribute to, say, electronic harassment.
The speaker offers a similar kind of unifying idea. They're saying, well, maybe it's not necessarily directed energy weapons causing that feeling, but maybe it's this biofilm reacting to the general electromagnetic fields or radio signals that are just around us in the environment.
So it shifts the focus from an external attack
Yeah.
to something biological happening on the skin surface.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big shift.
It really is. And they stress that it was their own personal observations that led them down this path.
Right. And they get quite specific. They talk about noticing their skin having this sort of yellowish tint in areas that just wouldn't seem to come clean, no matter how much they washed. Almost like, a film was there and getting stained.
Yeah, like it was trapping dirt or something. They also mentioned skin peeling, but in unusual places.
Okay.
And one thing that really stood out to them, apparently, was finding fine hairs on one ear that seemed almost glued down.
Glued down.
Yeah, while the other ear looked normal, for them, that was a big clue. It suggested some kind of foreign substance sticking to the skin, something that wasn't just, like, dry skin.
Huh. Interesting. What else could do that, right?
Exactly.
And they believe this film is mostly invisible, which is why it gets missed.
That's their argument, that it often gets mistaken for just plain old dry skin when it gets flaky or itchy. Because you can't easily see it, they argue. It hasn't been recognized as this underlying factor.
Okay.
They also describe it sort of loosening up in hot showers, becoming almost gel-like.
And trapping debris then.
That's what they observed, yeah. And even experiencing tiny, shard-like pieces coming off their skin.
Shards?
Yeah, which they interpreted as bits of this biofilm shedding. So very specific personal observations driving this whole theory.
Okay, so how do they connect this biofilm idea specifically to the targeted individual symptoms?
Well, the key link, in their view, is how this biofilm supposedly reacts to electromagnetic fields or radio signals, EMF,
Right, the energy waves all around us.
Exactly. They're proposing this biofilm has a kind of biological sensitivity to those fields.
And they mentioned using potassium iodide and having reactions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting part. They describe feeling things like pain or fluttering, twitching. Specifically in those areas, TIs often report issues with, like eyes, ears, jaw joints.
Right after taking the potassium iodide.
Almost immediately, according to them. And their explanation was that the iodide was, attacking the fungus deep inside those areas, causing those sensations.
It does make you wonder about how substances might interact differently in different spots.
It does. They also talked about shock-like sensations in their legs,
Which went away with treatment.
which reportedly subsided once they started their self-treatment protocol. For them, this just further cemented the link between all these different feelings and this biofilm idea.
Okay, so that brings us to the self-treatment part.
Yes, they're a strong advocate for using a combination of potassium iodide and boron, specifically a saturated solution of potassium iodide.
What does that mean, saturated?
It means basically dissolving the potassium iodide powder in water until absolutely no more will dissolve, until you see crystals sitting at the bottom. Maximum concentration.
Gotcha. And they give dosages.
They do. They suggest starting low, maybe 250 to 500 milligrams, and then working up to about a gram 3 times a day.
Wow. For how long?
For about 6 to 12 weeks, they suggest, and then maybe a lower maintenance dose after that.
Okay, but we absolutely have to stress here, and the speaker says this too, they are not a doctor.
Crucially important, this is entirely based on their own personal experiments. Self-treating like this can be risky.
Definitely. Anyone considering anything like this should be incredibly cautious and ideally talk to a real healthcare professional.
Absolutely. But the self-treatment aspect is central to their story. It's about taking control, finding their own answer.
And it's a big departure from, standard medical thinking, and even from some common ideas within the TI or Morgellons communities.
It really is. The speaker is quite direct about rejecting the idea that targeted individuals are, being zapped by people with weapons.
They think they've figured this out on their own.
That's what they say. By focusing purely on their own body and deliberately avoiding the online TI communities.
Why avoid them?
They felt those communities were full of disinformation, was the term used. So a real emphasis on personal experience over shared online knowledge.
Which is understandable, wanting to trust your own senses. But, sometimes those online groups offer support too, even if you have to sift through the info carefully.
True. But for this speaker, the goal was finding their own path to becoming, as they put it, free from being targeted.
And they believe fixing this biofilm is the way.
That's their conviction, yes.
The recording also mentions other symptoms that connect to this. Skin changes again.
Yeah, changes in color or appearance, sometimes looking kind of unhealthy or maybe prematurely aged, like sun damage, but without the sun exposure.
And again, they link that back to the biofilm maybe getting stained.
That's the idea they propose. They also point to what they see as distinctive marks, specifically on the upper cheekbone, near the nose and sinus area.
Citing themselves and others.
Yeah, mentioning Harlan Gerard as another example besides themselves, looking for these sort of shared physical signs.
They also mentioned something about facial appearance. Eyebrows.
Yes, describing a look where eyebrows seem pulled back and up. They use James Holmes as an example. They wonder if it's related to muscles being affected somehow.
All connected back to the biofilm hypothesis.
In their view, yes. They also remember earlier sensations feeling like paralysis or Botox.
Numbness and stiffness.
Exactly. In the face, head, neck, arms, legs. They even had an experience where one arm felt completely, quote, dead for days. And finally, that feeling of something crawling on the skin at night.
Which made them think bed bugs at first.
Initially, yeah. But then they noticed bite marks appearing only on them. So another strange physical thing they folded into this biofilm explanation.
Okay. So let's try and wrap this up. The core argument in this recording is
that this universal fungal biofilm on our skin is potentially the underlying factor for people identifying as Morgellons patients and as targeted individuals.
It's presented as an alternative explanation for their symptoms. For Morgellons, the fibers are biofilm growths, not skin growths.
And for TIs, the sensations are the biofilm reacting to ambient EMF or radio signals, not necessarily external attacks.
And the speaker's solution, the one they found for themselves, involves this self-treatment with saturated potassium iodide and boron.
Right. But again, we have to emphasize these are personal observations, a self-developed theory. It's not accepted medical diagnosis or scientifically validated treatment.
Absolutely critical point.
But diving into this one person's perspective, it really highlights that human need to find explanations, right? Especially for experiences that are confusing or isolating.
It definitely does. And it leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. Could there be, overlooked factors connecting experiences that seem totally unrelated?
And what if future research did look more closely at biofilms? In conditions where we don't currently think they're involved, what might we find?
It just shows how much we're still learning about the body and how it interacts with, well, everything around us. Always more questions to ask.